If the United States went to war against Russia, they would absolutely get destroyed. The US military is not trained to fight strongmen. In fact, when they did, they lost. Perfect example is Vietnam. American soldiers got destroyed, and we're talking about almost 50 years ago, where US soldiers fighting against rice farmers were losing. This was also very true when it comes to US soldiers that were fighting in Afghanistan. And many of these men grew up in the hard times, right? Hard times in Vietnam, hard times in Afghanistan. And those Afghan men fought off Russia prior to and during the Cold War, and then later on fought against the United States. And these are people who do not have technology, they don't have a standing military, they don't have a standing air force, they don't have a standing navy. And the US basically got beat back. This is why, for the better part of 20 years, despite occupying their country, they could not beat back the men, and so eventually they lost the war, and many soldiers, of course, lost their lives. Because of the good times in the United States, many of these American soldiers are actually unfit. There was a study that came out not too long ago where 1 out of 4 U.S. soldiers are actually obese, and for many of the recruits that they bring into the military, 20% of the male recruits are obese, and up to 40% of the women are obese. And this is the state of the American people. Many of the young people are not fit for war. Forget about just being physically fit. Many of them are not even mentally fit to go to war to protect themselves, because for the most part they've lived a coddled life. And many of the men who grew up in the hard times become strong men. Perfect example is what's going on in Russia. Russia grew up during the hard times. They have grown up in periods of sanctions. And despite being sanctioned by the United States, they are still thriving. Why? Because hard times create strong men. And many of those men will fight and die. This is why they utilize men in Ukraine, and of course why Ukrainian men are being destroyed, because of living an easier time than many of the men that grew up in sanctioned Russia. Ukraine, in essence, had been coddled by the United States, having the U.S. created a coup way back, and so of course all this money is then flowing into Ukraine, and as a result, the people enjoy the good times, while the men, of course, have to, at the end of the day, go to war and die. It is what it is. It is the state of what is going on. And so just recently, Joe Biden had called up, I believe it was 3,000 of the reserves to get ready to deploy to Europe, because I think they had dedicated something like 300,000 troops that were going to go to some sort of exercise that they were having out there. The result is many of these people are going to die. I have no doubt that it is what it is. The lives of the hard men that have grown up in Russia, they will be stronger men, just like the men in Afghanistan, just like the men in Vietnam. It is the reality of hard times create strong men. Good times create weak men. Hence the obesity that you see in the U.S. military and among the recruits that they try to recruit from, and among the demonization of many of the white men who make up most of the military. So what is the United States going to do? They're going to lose. What is the outcome going to be if the West goes into a hot war with Russia and they lose badly? The reality is the West will plunge into poverty, because people will no longer be afraid of Western military, which is all that they had, and their technology, which the nations are already seeing, having given much of the technology to Ukraine. It did not prove as influential as they thought it was going to be. Now, of course, they might use this so that they can strategize And shit, Russia is doing this with their B team. They're not even using their A team. They're using their B team. So while the US might use this information to learn, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. And so if they do foolishly choose to go to war and lose, which I don't think that they would foolishly do, what they'll do is they'll clamp down at home. This is why you hear of the restrictions that are going to be going forward, of learning to live with less. This is why they talk about not utilizing natural gas, or we're going to shove people into cities. You're going to learn to eat bugs, the climate nonsense. We're going to depopulate the people. It's because they realistically they can no longer care for all these people who are completely dependent upon the government. They have all these people. This is why, when King Solomon was going to become ruler, the Bible says that he prayed. He prayed for the most valuable thing that a ruler needed to be successful. He prayed for wisdom. And so the Bible says that God said to King Solomon, as a result of you not praying for your enemies to be delivered into your hand, or for riches, etc., he says, not only will I give you wisdom, but I would also give you all these other things. Because King Solomon realized, how am I going to lead these people without wisdom? And so that is why the Bible says, when the people have a good ruler, the people thrive, the people flourish. But when they have a bad ruler, the result is the opposite for the people. And this is what you see in the United States and across the West. This is why they have to import from other nations, because their own people have become coddled for so long that the women say, I don't even need a man. I'll just depend on the government. And it is what it is, and this is what you get. This is what you get. And so we'll have to see how foolish the United States and these old people are going to be, whether they realize that we're old, we're 80s, most of these people are old, and so they're like, we're going to die anyway. And they could say, fuck these kids, and screw up the future and launch nukes. Or they can say, you know what, we need to clamp down on these people, and we're going to shove them into cities, or we're going to depopulate them. We're going to push depopulation agenda. This is what you see going on. It's not an easy thing when you have so many people that are dependent upon you. Think of, for many of you men, when you realize, shit, maybe I don't want to get married. Maybe I don't want to have kids. Maybe I only want to have one or two, because you realize the difficulty and the weight of the responsibility that is put upon your shoulders. What do you do when the people run to you and they say, as the Bible says, you have a mantle? This is what the Bible said in the time of the end people would do. People become so fearful, unable to live and direct themselves, that they would go to anybody and say, here, you become our leader. And they throw the mantle, right? They throw the weight of responsibility upon your shoulders. How do you think many of these people feel who put themselves into positions that they raise their hands and say, I'll be a leader? And many of them are corrupt because of the influential corruption of the people, because the people are corrupt, and the people will look for someone who is corrupt to lead them. Tax the rich, steal their money, right? Taxation is theft. How do you implement socialism in a country without the utilization of wicked and corrupt people and put them into position? You can't. So the result is that the people will only look for immoral and unrighteous individuals to lead them, because what they want them to do, the acts that they want them to commit, are immoral and unrighteous. They want them to steal from this group over here and give it to me. This is why you hear Americans complain, oh, you're giving this money to Ukraine, or you're sending money over here when that money should be given to us. It is the state of the country, because the people lack morality. And I forget which founding father had said that the Constitution was designed for a moral people. This is how could you have small government and most people, in essence, living on their own land and cultivating that land without personal responsibility? It is the right of the people, right? Talking about the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, and that there should be a standing militia. This is what the people are responsible for, or supposed to be responsible for. Do you think most people nowadays would be are willing to be responsible for their own protection? No. Many of these people, they make the government responsible for that. They make the government responsible for their health care. They make the government responsible for their children. They make the government responsible for their health care. This is not the people that the founding fathers had, in essence, created the Constitution for. However you want to view their goal. Yes, it was for landowners and for people in authority, and it was for keeping the government small, so the government would be in the hands of a small people. But the people themselves should be righteous landowners, and the government should have limited authority. But the people advocated for the government to have more authority and to steal money from people abroad and to steal money from people within the country. It is what it is. We will have to see how it ends, but in my opinion, all socialism always ends in communism. Because the decadence, that people become so used to the high standard of living. I mean, shit, America uses like 20 to 30% of all the natural resources in the world. They only make up what? I think it's like 14% of the global population, if that. So hence, there really is a lack of equality. And as many of these other nations start to grow and become more powerful, because America exports all of their production, and they start to grow and become more industrialized, they want a piece of the good times because they've grown up in the hard times. Think about it, if you grew up in the Philippines, or if you grew up in Vietnam, or if you grew up in many of these Middle Eastern countries, or if you grew up in many Latin American countries, you have grown up in the hard times. And as these countries start to become wealthier because they are industrializing, they want a piece of the good times. And as the good times become so great that the people feel that they don't even have to work, that they don't even have to produce what they need for themselves to sustain themselves, they think, oh, we'll just hire people and create money out of thin air and give it to these people in exchange for their goods and for their services. They imagine that party will go on forever. And the reality is, it does not. Socialism always comes to an end, and when the resources dry up, it ends in communism, because the government will seek to save itself. And so they will, as they say, they will seize the means of production. You saw this during COVID. What they did in California with the moratoriums, that is what that looks like, where the government says you do not have authority over even your own property. You don't have authority over your own business. You have to do what we say. That is communism. And so you get a glimpse of it. But this is what the people advocate for. So what do? Oh, we need to stay home, and you need to give us money. We want child tax credit. You need to pay for health insurance. You need to lower the price of insulin because insulin is too high. You need to give us food stamps because we can't afford the food. And many of these people are obese. Look at the obesity rate in the country. You have 43% of Americans are obese. 80% of Americans are overweight. The good times. Because these people can afford to get fat and live high on the hog. That time is coming to an end. So how will you survive? Personal responsibility for both your family, for your children, for your wife, if you have any of those things, for yourself, most importantly, having either your own land to produce food, to minimize the cost of living, and so that people don't put shit in your food that you don't know. You have to be personally responsible for yourself. You have to go back to what the founding fathers envisioned, which is people being moral and personally responsible. And where is your morality going to come from? Originally, for many of these people, it came from the Bible. If you look back into the 60s and into the 70s, most Americans went to church. But as the people started to become more and more immoral, the men abandoned the church, and then the church became mostly feminized. And then eventually the women adapted. And now the women are immoral. It is what it is. Such is the state of the country. Anyway, feel free to leave your comment below. Thanks for watching. And of course, feel free to subscribe. And I will check you next time.